whom, so the role of decision makers. I believe they managed to put these ideas together in a very appealing way for the program of this seminar, and I wish you all 2 or a day and a half of very good work. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let's go to our keynote speaker, Michael Young, for his paper entitled Knowledge-Led Curriculum, Limits and Possibilities. Professor David Justin will introduce him and moderate the debate.
Michael Young. Well, I think it's sufficiently known and read it and reflected also. But was professor of sociology of curriculum in the Institute of Education of the University College of London, and is one of the most prestigious sociologists of education and curriculum nowadays. His book, the classic book, Knowledge and Control, New Directions for the Sociology of Education, from 1971, is a classical in the field in as much as it represents the emergence of the new sociology of education, which is focused on the issue of knowledge selection within the curriculum. But these most recent publications are oriented for the problem of knowledge. I can refer and I can cite some of them. Knowledge-led curriculum, pitfalls and possibilities. Knowledge, power and powerful knowledge revisited, 2019. And curriculum and the specialization of knowledge. It's a Routledge publication from 2016. And I think the work with Johan Muller, isn't it? Yes. The recent focus on this research has been on how to relate curriculum and pedagogy in the knowledge-based curriculum. You have been working with colleagues in specialist didactics, initially in history, geography, and religious education, at the Institute of Education's Specialist Subject Research Group, and its links with colleagues in Sweden and Finland. Professor Young, welcome. It's good to see you again. And the stage is yours.
Well, it's very good to be back in Lisbon. It's not a city I know as well as I would like. I feel more familiar with curriculum specialists, and there are some people who work as subject teachers in the schools. And I thought I would give a particular focus to my presentation by drawing on a theme from the work of the English sociologist Basil Bernstein, because he brings the two issues around sociology of education and curriculum, the two fields, together. He was worried that, in fact, there was something, he was very worried about his own discipline, and indeed mine, that I've been part of, because in somehow or other it didn't have an analysis of what he saw as education's three key message systems: curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. And he set out to try and say why, and this is what I want to give the first part of my talk to. And the second part, I'll say something about the particular developments around the debate about powerful knowledge that have taken place, particularly in England. Not, I should clearly say, in the UK, because very different debates go on in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and in Wales. I hope this will be not too unrelated to your discussions in later sessions about autonomy, but I thought that possibly I would just say a word just to remind those of you who are not familiar with the English system that in many ways, when I heard David D'Astino talk briefly earlier about the networks, that in a sense we face a completely opposite situation to Portugal. We had a strongly decentralized, strong local system of education in England, organized by elected local governments. And this is being steadily undermined by governments in the interests, from their point of view, of, in fact, schools being more efficient in what they do. They've done this through two apparently contradictory but actually related ways, through significant increase in regulation, through the inspection system and through the ranking of schools, through funding and through the qualifications and examinations. On the other hand, they've promoted institutional autonomy by allowing schools to, or fund schools to leave local government and become, in a sense, state schools with private funding. We call them, bizarrely, either free schools, or which are not free, or, in fact, academies. I think that's because it has an old traditional name. This institutional autonomy means that less than half our schools now have to follow the national curriculum, and they are increasingly controlled rather than regulated by an exam system and a system of inspection. This has led to a very, many ways, contradictory situation, I think. The only move that, in fact, towards approaching the issue of autonomy in England is that, in fact, the Labour government has produced a very weak policy for a national education service. They have at least picked up on the fact that if you give autonomy, increasing autonomy to individual schools, then in fact you have a problem that they are allowed to select their pupils, and in fact some pupils find it very difficult, or parents of pupils find it very difficult to get to school at all. And this could, so this is a serious issue. Now I mention that, and also, and this relates, I suppose, more directly to where I work, that in fact, on the question of the curriculum, within the broad field of education studies, which includes curriculum studies and sociology and other disciplines, it is itself deeply divided. It's divided between those that I have in fact been associated with, who emphasize the importance of there being a common, what I call powerful knowledge for all pupils, and which, because of shortage of funds and in fact regulation, becomes not knowledge for all, but I would call it memorization and testing for all. And on the other hand, you have the other strands of the educational studies community, who in a sense resist, they see the emphasis on knowledge as actually in a sense undermining the opportunities for the more disadvantaged pupils, and emphasize that the curriculum should be defined much more in relation to the needs of children, individual children. And as a result of that, of course, you actually get greater inequality. So I think we are in a sense in a very difficult situation in many ways in which we in England, and I think that's why I'm extremely sorry that I shan't be staying till tomorrow, and because I think I've got a lot to learn from others in Europe who will be talking later. Just to go back to Basil Bernstein for a bit, my focus on him has a somewhat biographical aspect. He was my tutor. He was later my head of department. He became one of the strongest critics of my early work, associated, David, you mentioned, with the new sociology of education. And in the last 10 or 15 years, I think his work has influenced mine more than anyone I can think of. So it's quite a career for Basil Bernstein in relation to me. When I did my master's degree, sociology of education was solely concerned with the distribution of educational opportunities and how in England that opportunities were largely determined by social class. So I remember my surprise when Bernstein, my tutor, said to me, write a dissertation on the curriculum. Now, he's if anybody here has met him, he's not an easy person to say no to. And I certainly couldn't do that. So I had to go off and try and write a dissertation about a field which, in fact, sociologists had not discussed at all. It was before, I mean, all his work up till then, as some of you will know, was been on language codes. And he hadn't got involved in the curriculum by then, and there was practically nothing written at all. So my dissertation, which I'm glad to say nobody will be able to find, I think, I ended up writing about trying to ask the question, why a sociologist appears so little interest in what, for most people would say, was at the heart of education, curriculum. When I look at sociology of education journals today, in the USA, even more than in England, I find very little has changed. A colleague of mine, some of you have come across in curriculum field, Deng Zongyi, and he edits the Journal of Curriculum Studies. He tried to get a symposium on the sociology of the curriculum that related to my work accepted by AERA, the American Education Research Association. Some of you have ever been to that. It's about 14,000 education researchers. It's an intimidating experience, I can tell you. I went once and I haven't been again. Anyway, I mention that because the proposal for the symposium on the sociology of the curriculum was turned down by all the different sessions of AERA. It was turned down by the sociologists of education because it didn't have enough quantitative data. It was turned down by the curriculum people because it was dealing with knowledge and not with the very rarefied things that curriculum theory gets involved with these days. Anyway, it was quite a lesson. Back in London, my colleagues now, and I wonder one of these days when I completely retire rather than partly retire, my colleagues, my doctoral students are mostly Chinese, and some of them are quite excellent. Occasionally they're Brazilians. I haven't had one for some time in actual Portuguese. And my colleagues that I write with are either from Australia or New Zealand or South Africa. And more recently, which I have found very exciting, is what is going on in England, is that I've been working more with teacher educators, people who work with school teachers who are specialists in particular school subjects. And they have got interested in sociology of education, and some of you may have come across the book that I wrote with my colleague David Lambert, who's a geographer, called Knowledge in the Future School. This was a kind of attempt, really, to make what seemed rather abstract ideas in sociology relevant to teachers. And we came up with the idea of powerful knowledge as a curriculum principle that could be applied in schools. It was largely a response. I gave a talk at that time to a group of on the curriculum, to a group of headmasters and headmistresses in schools. And after I'd given the talk, somebody came up to me, who I'd never met before, and said, "I've read your book." Now, I never thought for a moment that, in fact, head teachers read books by sociologists of education. So I was very taken by this. So I said, "Well, that's wonderful. We must meet." And it was really in discussions with her that led to this book. And she has, Carolyn Roberts is her name, she has a chapter in the book that David Lambert and I wrote. And in it, I think, is what she calls, in her chapter, what she calls a manifesto for my school. She was, and basically this has got 10 points, and if I thought about it, I would have brought it, 10 points about why knowledge is important. And I thought to myself, it expresses it better than I could. It was, and I've used it in a whole range of different countries, even, believe it or not, Vietnam. We discussed this manifesto, and it was a manifesto for knowledge. Now, I still find, but anyway, that was what, certainly, that was what led to the book, Knowledge in the Future School. I still find this neglect by English sociologists of the curriculum, and the fact that we had in England Bernstein, who with Bourdieu is arguably the greatest sociologist of education there's been since Durkheim. I find it a puzzle. And what I wanted to say a little bit about was Bernstein's attempt to make sense of this. From the early 1970s, he had a major concern, which I disregarded completely at the time, even though I was in the same department as him, completely. And he thought the two major traditions in sociology of education were deeply misguided, and that they had two assumptions that had led the field in the wrong direction that I've since come to question myself. One was that sociology, and sociology of education in particular, should always be seen about the distribution of power in society. That's the starting point of any sociology. Now, in a sense, once you look at the distribution of power, you tend to think about how you can reduce or remove that power. And that actually takes you, in a sense, into politics, and it takes you away from thinking about what's happening in education. And the other thing that he was worried about was the kind of social constructivist critique that was dominant in the new sociology of education, which critiqued everything in any curriculum and pedagogy in terms of power relation and how it was disadvantaging working class kids. Now, it's not that there's not some truth in that, but he actually thought that, in a sense, and I think this is the thing I learned, that to work in education studies, critique is not enough, because in the end, education is a practical thing that people are doing in the schools, and if all you're doing is showing why they're getting it wrong, then in a sense, you're not being a resource that you would hope that education research would be. He picked out a quote from something I had forgotten, but I wrote, where I said, way back then, and here I quote, "The principles of the selection of organization of knowledge that underlie curricula and their institutional and interactional setting in schools and classrooms and in the wider social structure, that massive project is the job of the sociology of education." However, the problem was we just criticized the existing system and we didn't take up that program. And when I look back, as you get older, you find yourself looking back more, and you always hope that you're not just looking back nostalgically, but you're looking back to learn, and so you don't make the same mistakes again. I think the reason was that, in a sense, we didn't have an adequate theoretical framework to actually tackle those big issues. And so we ended up by saying, we'll just point out how bad everything is, and possibly some other people will come up with the better ideas. And I won't go into that because it had a rather a personal turn, those of us involved in that had an almost oppositional relationship to Bernstein at the time, and some of his writings became increasingly obscure, and very little notice was taken of him. The second approach that Bernstein thought was misguided was one that is probably more familiar because it's persisted, and in many ways is stronger theory, is basically the cultural reproduction theory of people like Pierre Bourdieu. Wherever I go, I'm surprised, for instance, that Bourdieu is the leading sociologist of education in China. Now, take that in and think about that in relation to the Chinese Communist Party, and we will think. What Bernstein did was to try and explain why he thought this was misguided. And here's a quote, what he says. He says, the theory of cultural reproduction, which says that the theory of cultural reproduction, those theories and approaches presuppose what is not addressed by them, and perhaps inadvertently what cannot be addressed by them as a consequence of the form they take. I want to try and explain that. But what they did not address, of course, was the substance of education, because in fact they actually thought that education was doing society's work, sustaining inequalities or whatever, preparing well or badly, preparing for labour markets, those kind of things. This is how he expressed what cultural reproduction theories did, and I quote. He was interested in how the cultural features of the curriculum disguise the power relations which they transmit through the maintenance of symbolic violence, as schooling becomes almost a kind of pathology, because schooling is just producing the inequalities and the failures that, in a sense, we experience. He argued that this diagnosis, treating existing curricula and pedagogies as a kind of pathology, perpetuating inequality, what they do is to fail to describe the non-pathological form of pedagogic discourse, what's going on in the school. They expressed the way schooling privileges the interests of a dominant group, and they misrepresent the cultures of, this is what schooling does, this is what they say. However, what it doesn't do is to generate any specific descriptions of what goes on in school that might or might not do that. Now, it took me, and the question was why? And it took me a long time to go back to Bernstein and begin to get a sense of an answer. And I'm very grateful to colleagues, doctoral students in particular, who've helped me to actually go through that journey and to actually, in a sense, get a different angle on Bernstein. Because what he said was, and what they did, and this is important, I hope I can explain it to you, was that in fact, the idea of cultural reproduction has the view of education as a carrier of relations outside of education. So it's a kind of passive carrier. It's like, in fact, you put the stuff on the train and it carries to the next station. So what happens then is that education is a kind of black box relaying, so this is the key word, relaying patterns of dominance with respect to class, patriarchy, and race. And so the what of education, actually what's happening in the classroom, what knowledge is being learnt, what processes are going on there, is disregarded. The what, actually what those of us, well, I used to teach chemistry in school many years ago, and some of you are school teachers now, many of us do in our everyday lives, from the point of view of cultural reproduction, becomes a vacuum with no structures, no forms, and no rules. And so, in a sense, the content becomes empty. And that's why, in a sense, sociologists, for a long time, have never actually bothered to try and understand that content, because it's been treated as empty, because everything that was happening was being determined from outside. This assumes that the internal relations, what goes on in a school, which arguably ought to be the subject of analysis of a social science, is not worth investigating. Now, I think you can understand how attractive this was and still is to many academics. It gave them a kind of unique critical stance on the prevailing system, but it didn't offer them any alternatives or anything that anyone could do. I found this to an I sent to one or two colleagues here, I found this to an exaggerated extent when I go to Brazil, as I've been to quite a few times, in fact, particularly in the areas of sociology and curriculum studies, which have become, some of them have become so rarefied and so removed that you can no longer recognize that there's anything called curriculum at all. There are exceptions there, I assure you, and I was talking to Francisco last night about Dimitri Saviani, some of you have come across, who I think has a really, really interesting analysis and is not known widely enough. So the focus of cultural reproduction then is limited to understanding how external power relations are carried by the education system. And I mentioned earlier, my Chinese doctoral students tell me that in fact this cultural reproduction theory is no less prevalent, popular in China at all. And we've tried to puzzle out why it is there. It's as if pathologizing what goes on in schools has some function for academics. I'm interested in discussion to what extent this applies at all in Portugal. It certainly does in England. Now, I think that this phenomenon, which I think is important, whether one is a social scientist or curriculum studies or any field, and indeed somebody studying to become initial training of teacher, because in a sense you get some of this there. I think Bernstein introduced one of his most original and, I think, neglected insights. It's the distinction between treating education as a relay of society's inequalities. His argument was that the sociology of education, particularly theories like Bourdieu's, had focused only on what was relayed and said nothing about the relay itself. So from the point of view of cultural reproduction, pedagogic practice, what teachers do in schools, relay class relations, they relay gender relations, they relay race relations, they relay all kinds of things external to education itself. And Bernstein's argument was that sociology of education had to analyze what is specific to education as a relay, something that in various ways some of us working in the sociology of the curriculum in recent years have in fact tried to do. And as I mentioned earlier, this has largely been outside of England, although often within Anglophone countries. So what those, I think, and many of those people have been inspired by Bernstein's work, with not necessarily grasping the whole theory. But what they have done is to hold on to the distinction between pedagogic and curriculum practice as a relay and pedagogic practice as what the practice relays, the what and the how, as he said. Here's a rather cryptic quote from Bernstein, which we can return to, which I thought that it was worth mentioning. He says this, and it depends. If you accept that as a teacher, what your primary thing you're trying to do always is to transmit valued knowledge. There's no, that, it's difficult to not disagree with that, that in a sense, schools have a unique role in passing knowledge on from one generation to another, and as knowledge has become more specialized, we've needed more specialized institutions like schools, and this is in fact what teachers are doing. He says, if we are to understand transmission, and it is the big question, I think, that in fact the sociology of the curriculum has not properly yet addressed, and I'll come back to that towards the end. He says, we must be able to understand what he calls the relations to social class, gender and race, and relations within. And it's the relations within, both in relation to transmission and acquisition, that are largely unresearched. So I want to make one final distinction, which has been important from Bernstein, and be a bit more concrete. He makes a distinction between what he calls surface and deep metaphors. That sounds rather abstract, but actually I think when I thought about it, essentially I resisted the example that he gave us to start with, but I actually think it's really powerful. Now, he is concerned with what he calls the deep metaphors that underlie how we think, theorize, do research, analysis in education. And he reckons that very often we just stay at the level of surface. And that is true about much empirical research. And I think it's important to realize that we've tried to, a lot of empirical research tries to model itself on the natural sciences, where in a sense the empirical research is rooted in a very precise theory, but we're in a context where we don't have a precise theory. So what we tend to do is to root our empirical research in our preconceptions, which are often not examined. I don't know whether he's a bit unfair on that, on Bourdieu, but he's always having a bit of a go at Bourdieu through his time. I think they saw themselves as cross-the-channel competitors somehow or other. But he was once invited to be a visiting professor at the Sorbonne, at the École Pratique, I think this was where Bourdieu was. And he was invited to come for a term, and he lasted 2 weeks, because clearly they didn't, in fact, actually form a close relationship. He gives the example of habitus, which is a favourite Bourdieu concept, which I find a lot of students use it and think that they've explained something, and perhaps they have. Anyway, what Bernstein says is that the problem with Bourdieu's concept of habitus is that, in fact, it's exemplified by the outcomes it gives of habitus, not the deep metaphor that underlies it, in which case then it may not be such a good concept. Anyway, what it doesn't do, and I've never come across it doing, what it doesn't do is actually to generate new ways of thinking about educational policy practice, which is what we want. In reflecting on his own work, he suggests that he inherited his deep